Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the east where the Russians have advanced across the west of Donetsk in three separate directions. Starting out to the east of Vuhledar, the Russians have expanded their zone of control to the east of the town. This is a fair distance away. The Ukrainian presence in the area are mainly located around the fortified areas that the Ukrainians have available, where they launch raids and commit to skirmishes within these fields where the Russians are attempting to push through the frontline positions of the Ukrainians. Essentially, what we're seeing is that the Russians push through towards the Ukrainian fortified positions in the area, then the Ukrainians send out Bradleys or other infantry fighting vehicles to conduct raids on those positions that the Russians recently captured, and skirmishes take place along those areas. In this recent advance by the Russians, which is seen with this located footage here, we saw that the Russians stormed a Ukrainian fortified positions after heavy artillery shelling, and they took control over that area. Following that, the Ukrainians launched his Bradley infantry fighting vehicles to launch a counterattack and recapture these positions, or simply to attack the Russian forces that managed to capture the position and were attacked by an FPV drone on the way there and was blown up. That is exactly the type of fighting we see taking place with this positional fighting along the front, and we see that similar case by Ryorivka. After the capture of the town by the Russians, they're now advancing in a southern direction, capturing the forest lines in the area, and through this fighting we see them getting closer to the Ukrainian fortified position in between Pobeda and Ryorivka, where the Russians are attacking from the north and will likely start operations from the south as well, with the objective of storming it both from Ryorivka and Pobeda. As the fortified position is located between the two settlements, the Russians are able to attack from both positions towards this fortified position. Getting control of it would significantly improve the Russian position in the area. Further north in direction of the Vovchansk river and the lakes, as well as reservoirs in the area, the Russians have managed to push through into the residential area of Karelivka, where they have managed to gain a foothold within it, and the fighting now takes place within it, as we see with this geolocated footage here. The Russian troop presence here shows the current Russian operation to gain control over the area here between Yasnorodivka and Karelivka, the northern parts of it, east of the reservoir, to gain control over the area and have a strong flank ahead of operations further north towards Kushne and the rest of Karelivka east of the Vovcha river. So we see positional fighting taking place in the area, and the Russians storming the Ukrainian positions within the riverbank east of the reservoir. At the same time, we see positional fighting continuing across the entirety of the front, and in direction of Jasovyar, the Russians have re-entered Kalinina and have managed to gain access to the central parts of it and re-entered the central part of the village. So we saw first the Russians gain control over the area and even cross the canal line. Following that, the Ukrainians launched counterattacks and recaptured the area due to the holding of the high ground north of the village and the fortified positions there. The Russians have since expanded their control over more of the fortified positions and have re-entered Karelivka, where fighting now takes place in the central parts of it. Until the Russians gain control over the northern parts, they will not be able to consolidate their positions in Kalinina. Moving on, we see here in the north by the Kharkiv region, the Ukrainians have made yet another advance. This is a small advance, but there was a fortified position of the Russians in the area, as we see with this geolocated footage here. The Russians were pushed back and lost this fortified position due to a Ukrainian unit storming the area and regaining control of it. So with this, we see that the Russians will have a hard time holding on to the eastern parts of the northern parts of Vovchansk due to the Ukrainians encroaching on their positions from the east and from the west. The Ukrainians have been meeting more and more success in the area since they were able to concentrate enough troops to conduct offensive operations and are slowly pushing the Russians back, where positional fighting continues all throughout the town of Vovchansk in the northern parts. But we also see the Ukrainian recapture of Tigre, and the map correction by Syriac Maps shows that there's no Russian presence here east of Tigre, which means that the Ukrainian positions along the river line is secure, and the only Russian presence that is significant here in the area is the one in Vovchansk. If the Russians lose Vovchansk, they will likely lose all of their positions here in their eastern incursion. This is why Vovchansk is extremely important for the Russians to hold on to if they want to keep their offensive operations in the north, and the Ukrainians, if they recapture it, they will have faced a major victory here in the north, recapturing the position and pushing the Russians out of the northern parts of Kharkiv. Similarly, in the direction of the western parts, the town of Hlyboke is the main town. There's also Lukyantsy, however, in this section of the front, where the Russians still have a presence. If the Ukrainians recapture both Hlyboke and Lukyantsy, then the Russian positions here in the western parts are hardly pressed, but they also have further fortified positions further north. This means that the western part is not the same as in Vovchansk. In the Vovchansk direction, the areas here west of Vovchansk are just major fields and forest patches. If the Russian positions near Vovchansk are lost, the Ukrainians can flank these positions, hit the supply roads, and through positional fighting or guerrilla fighting slowly push the Russians out, and the Russians will not be able to launch any major operations in the area to regain control over it or hold control over it. On the contrary, the western parts, the Russians would here be able to hold their positions if they lose Hlyboke, but in the east they would not be able to hold their positions if they lose Vovchansk. The positions further north are much less defended and defensible in general. It is also unlikely that the Ukrainians would push further than Vovchansk, as they would simply regain control over Vovchansk and use that as a fortified position to prevent further Russian incursions in the north. These areas are insignificant for the Ukrainians to hold on to, as they were already prior to the Russian offensive largely abandoned, similar to the eastern parts where there's hardly any Ukrainian presence, if any at all. And here north of Kharkiv, there's also little Ukrainian presence. The main presence was near Lipsy, Hlyboke, Lukyantsy, and Vovchansk. There is one other presence that the Ukrainians have an interest in, and that is Staritsya, with heavy fighting took place over, and that is due to the proximity to the Vovchansk river line, the western flank of Vovchansk, as well as its near position to the forest patches here in the area. If the Russians continue to hold on to it, they can infiltrate the forest patch south of it and significantly expand their DRG presence within Ukraine, as they could use that as an opportunity to push through and conduct guerrilla fighting within Ukraine and hit the Ukrainian supply line towards Vovchansk. Therefore, Staritsya is an important position that the Ukrainians are interested in regaining. Vuhledar is insignificant by itself and needs Staritsya as well to be able to be a significant position. Therefore, the four areas of interest of the Ukrainians right now is in the direction of Hlyboke, Vovchansk, Staritsya, and Lukyantsy. If the Ukrainians recapture all of these four positions, then the Russian presence in the north is practically non-existent. Moving back further south in the Luhansk-Kharkiv direction, we see here that the Russians are conducting further operations to prepare for the offensive operation in the direction of Borova. We see that with this footage here showing a Russian explosion at the bridge here in between Khorsivka and Borova. With this footage, we see that the bridge was partially blown. This is impossible now. The Ukrainians will not be able to pass through it, limiting supply and movement through and from Borova. So we see that the Russians are conducting long-range raids across the Oskar River line, hitting the supply lines and supply roads as bridges across in preparation for the offensive operation. They are also heavily bombarding the Ukrainian fortified positions in the area with artillery and FPV drones, as well as other drones that they use to hit the Ukrainian vehicles and units in the area. The main argument for the Russian incursion into the north by Kharkiv is that they are distracting Ukrainian units, relocating troops from the south and the east to the north, which has allowed the Russians to conduct further offensive operations in the east. So far in the direction of Avdiivka and the general area in the south and the east, we have not seen significant advances by the Russians compared to what we saw before. It is practically the same rate that they are advancing in near Avdiivka as prior to the Kharkiv offensive. This means if we see significant progress anywhere across the front, then we will see the clear effects of the Russian incursions in the north. And if we do not, then we can say that the Ukrainians had enough reserves to deal with such an operation in the north, and the Russians either need to increase the pressure in the north or expand the front line further. Otherwise, their distraction is not enough to break through the Ukrainian lines in the east or in the south. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.